Beatrice set her porcelain cup onto the small table with a sharp click that broke the silence of the room. For 5 years, the heavy green velvet curtains of the Great West Wing at Pine Crest had remained completely closed to the world outside. Her quiet assistant, a woman whose name Beatrice could never quite recall, nodded slowly and adjusted her sweater without saying a single word. People from the nearby towns wrote letters asking about the master of the house, but Beatrice knew they only cared about his massive fortune and his family name. They sent their young daughters to visit under the pretense of a summer vacation in Maine, hoping to catch a glimpse of the wealthy recluse. The girls would arrive for afternoon tea, sit stiffly in the parlor, and wait for the master to appear in the shadows. Caspian would eventually walk into the room polite and perfectly composed, answering their questions about the weather and their families with a low, calm voice. But the young women could never stop staring at his snow-white hair, his shockingly pale skin, and the way he completely avoided the bright afternoon sunlight. They lasted only one afternoon before making an excuse to leave, frightened by the cold stillness of the massive estate and the strange nature of its master. The rain tapped against the glass windows of the small cottage where Beatrice spent her afternoons away from the main house. She explained that the girls would sometimes stay for dinner if they were brave, but the silence of the giant house always drove them away by nightfall. They wrote polite notes from their hotels in the morning and caught the first train back to their comfortable lives in the city. Her assistant murmured something about destiny and the natural order of things, which only made Beatrice shake her head in mild irritation. The anger she felt had become smooth over the years, replaced by a quiet acceptance of her family's unusual history. Caspian had not chosen this life, nor had he asked for the old lineage that made him the vampire king bound to the shadows and feared by the living. He was a man who once loved the bright coastal mornings and spent his hours building a vast collection of exotic orchids with his father. He used to know the name of every single plant in the glasshouses, but now he lived like a ghost in his own home, ignored by the villagers who only whispered about him from a safe distance. Grace Evans arrived at the small village station 2 days later on a bus that smelled of old leather and wet wool. She was 28 years old, and she carried herself with a steady calm that many people mistook for a lack of emotion. She was not plain possessing a strong face with clear gray eyes and long hands that looked both capable and steady. Her gray traveling suit was clean, but showed signs of careful repair along the seams of the jacket. Everything she owned in the world fit into 2 old wooden trunks and a large flat leather portfolio that she held tightly against her side. She had come to Silver Falls because Beatrice had sent her a short letter offering her a job cataloging and restoring a famous collection of rare plants. The money offered was enough to keep her safe from poverty for a very long time, which was exactly what she needed. Since her father died 6 months ago, Grace had learned that her deep knowledge of botanical classification and illustration was not something people paid for, especially when she had no family wealth to support her. A driver brought her to the cottage, where Beatrice was waiting in the same parlor watching the door with sharp blue eyes. She did not stand up when Grace entered, but she looked closely at the mended jacket, the heavy boots, and the leather case held like a shield. Beatrice omitted the usual small talk and asked immediately if Grace was the daughter of the late botanist Thomas Evans. Grace confirmed that she was, standing straight and meeting the older woman's gaze without any sign of nervousness. Beatrice mentioned that Thomas was a man who could identify a rare mountain flower from a single dried leaf, and she asked if Grace had inherited that same eye for detail. Grace did not give a long speech about her skills, but simply walked over to the low table, untied the leather straps of her case, and opened it. She turned the pages carefully, showing dozens of drawings that looked alive against the paper. There were detailed sketches of wild ferns, the complex structure of a morning glory, and the delicate veins of a forest leaf. Beatrice looked at each drawing for a long time, her fingers moving slowly over the thick paper without touching the ink. She saw years of careful work, and steady focus in every line, recognizing the dedication it took to create such things. She looked up from a sketch of a rare tropical orchid and studied Grace's calm face for a moment before speaking. She explained that the grand glass houses at Pinecrest had been the pride of the estate when her brother was alive, and Caspian had cared for them deeply. After Caspian accepted his role as king and withdrew from the town, the plants had been left alone with nobody to care for them properly. The local gardener was excellent with the lawns and the rose bushes, but he knew nothing about the delicate structures of tropical orchids. Grace listened quietly, with her hands folded in her lap, understanding that this job would require her to live at the main estate. Beatrice stated clearly that the house was very quiet because her nephew required absolute privacy due to his condition. Grace looked directly at Beatrice and said she understood the terms of the letter, completely explaining that her only goal was to save the botanical collection. A small look of approval appeared in Beatrice's eyes, pleased that the young woman did not ask gossiping questions about Caspian's reputation. Beatrice closed the leather portfolio and told Grace that the position belonged to her if she chose to accept the terms. Grace accepted immediately because she had no other place to go and no other way to support herself in the winter. But as she said the words, she felt a quiet certainty that the orchids were not the only things waiting for her inside the walls of Pinecrest. She packed her drawings back into the case and thanked the older woman for the opportunity ready to face whatever lay ahead. The driver helped her load the trunks back onto the carriage, and they began the long drive up the winding hill toward the dark gates of the estate. Pinecrest appeared through the heavy Maine fog like a gray stone mountain surrounded by tall pine trees that stood like quiet guards. The house was massive and beautiful, but it seemed to hold its breath against the cold air that blew from the nearby ocean. An entire side of the building was dark, its large windows covered by heavy wood shutters that kept the daylight from entering the rooms. The housekeeper, Mrs. Weaver, met Grace at the massive front door, wearing a simple black dress and an apron that was stiff with starch. She was a tall woman who did not smile, looking at Grace with an expression that suggested she expected the new botanist to leave within a week. She welcomed Grace to the house in a dry voice, explaining that she would show her to her rooms in the East Wing immediately. She added that dinner was served at 7 o'clock every night, and she noted that the master always ate alone in his private quarters. The warning was clear. Grace was expected to do her work without causing any disturbance to the master of the house. The interior of the building was chilly, possessing the deep cold that stays in a large stone structure when many rooms are left unused for years. White sheets covered the furniture in the main hallways, and the air smelled of old wood beeswax and long periods of quiet. Grace's rooms were located at the end of the East Wing, offering a comfortable bed, a small desk, and a large window that looked out toward the gardens. From her glass, she could see the massive shape of the glass houses, a series of round glass domes that looked dull under the gray sky. The glass was covered in dirt and wild ivy, making the structures look like an abandoned monument in the middle of the overgrown yard. The next morning, Grace took the heavy iron key that Mrs. Weaver had left on her table and walked across the wet grass toward the structures. When she unlocked the door and pushed it open, she was met by a rush of warm, heavy air that smelled of damp earth and old leaves. The inside of the main dome was a complete mess of wild growth, where rare plants fought against each other for the little light that came through the dirty roof. Expensive orchids hung from rotting wooden baskets, their long gray roots reaching down into the empty air like pale fingers. Common ferns had grown over the stone paths, choking out the smaller, more delicate species that needed careful attention to survive. A thick layer of green moss covered the inside of the glass panes, turning the morning sunlight into a dim green glow that made the place feel underwater. Grace did not lose courage. She took off her wool hat, rolled up her sleeves, and prepared a notebook to start her plan. She spent her entire first day walking through the aisles, writing down the names of the surviving plants, and checking the condition of the soil. She found an old shed filled with rusty tools, a large water barrel, and everything she needed to begin the long process of cleaning. For 7 days, Grace worked completely alone, seeing nobody except the young footman who brought her a lunch tray, and Mrs. Weaver who checked on her every evening. The quiet of the giant estate became familiar to her, broken only by the sound of her own tools and the water dripping from the roof. In the middle of her second week, while she was standing on a wooden ladder to clean the glass panes, she felt a sudden change in the room. The air grew slightly cooler, and the birds outside the glass house stopped singing all at once, leaving the space completely silent. She stopped wiping the glass, keeping her cloth in her hand, and looked down toward the main entrance of the dome. A tall figure was standing near the door, positioned perfectly in the deepest shadow where the sun could not reach him. Caspian stood completely still, his snow-white hair catching the dim green light, and his pale skin looking almost luminous against his dark coat. He wore a dark wool suit with a simple white shirt, and his hands were resting on a walking stick made of dark wood. His eyes were wide open, a strange shade of amber that looked toward her but did not seem to blink or focus on her directly. Grace felt her heart give a heavy thump against her ribs, but she did not climb down from the ladder or make a sound. Caspian took one slow step forward, his head tilting slightly, as if he were listening to the sound of her breathing in the quiet space. He took a long, deep breath, tasting the smell of the damp soil, the vinegar she used for cleaning, and the faint scent of her skin. His face showed no emotion at all, but a small line appeared between his brows as he remained standing there for 5 minutes. The only sounds were the ticking of a clock in the distance and the water falling from a pipe into the dirt below. Then, without saying a single word, he turned around and vanished back into the dark corridors of the house. Caspian knew exactly when Grace arrived at the estate because the rhythm of the entire house shifted the moment she stepped through the door. He could hear her footsteps from his dark rooms in the west wing, noting that her walk was lighter than Mrs. Weaver's heavy step. He smelled her presence in the hallways, a clean scent that reminded him of wild clover and fresh rain after a long summer drought. For 5 years, he had lived inside his dark rooms, creating a world out of sounds, smells, and old memories that he could navigate perfectly. He knew which floorboards on the stairs made a sound, and he knew the exact number of steps from his leather chair to the fireplace. He had built this quiet fortress to keep himself away from the townspeople who looked at him with fear or spoke about his white hair with whispers. The arrival of this new botanist was something he had not wanted, having agreed to his aunt's request only during a moment of deep weariness. He had expected an old woman who would complain about the cold rooms for a few days and then return to the city on the next bus. He had not expected the steady, quiet energy that now came from the glass houses every single morning, changing the feel of the entire backyard. He had gone to the dome that afternoon to show his strength, intending to stand in the shadows, until her fear drove her away from his home. He expected her to drop her tools, scream, or offer a panicked apology for being in his presence, just as the other girls had done. Instead, she had simply remained on her high ladder, looking down at him with steady gray eyes that showed no terror at all. Her look was not full of the horror he usually felt from strangers, nor was it full of the heavy pity that his servants tried to hide. It was a calm, observing look, as if he were simply a new type of tree that had grown in the corner of her workspace. The memory of her steady gaze kept him awake in his dark room, feeling as unsettled as a man who finds a piece of furniture moved in the dark. He found himself walking back to the glass houses day after day, always arriving after the sun began to go down and the shadows grew long across the floor. He did not go inside the warm center of the room, choosing instead to stand near the wooden frame of the door where the light was faint. He listened to the sounds of her labor, learning the difference between the sharp click of her shears and the soft sound of her shovel in the dirt. He heard the rustle of her paper notebook when she wrote down her observations and the steady movement of her boots on the stone path. These were the sounds of someone bringing order to a place that had been dead for years, and he understood that language perfectly. He began to learn her daily schedule, knowing when she cleaned and when she sat at the old wooden bench. One afternoon, a week after their first meeting, he smelled a new scent that was sharp and sharp, mixing with the heavy smell of the wet dirt. He stepped inside the doorway, his boots making a single clear sound on the stone floor as he looked into the green room. He remarked that the air smelled different, his voice sounding low and slightly rough from many days of not speaking to anyone. He heard a small movement from the far side of the rows of plants, realizing she had not heard him approach this time. She did not jump or drop her tools, taking a short moment before answering him in a voice that was perfectly level and calm. She explained that she was treating the old orchids for a small pest that had started to grow on their leaves during the winter. She added that she was using a simple mixture of alcohol and natural oil to clean the stems before the insects could spread. Caspian remained silent, surprised that she had answered his question directly, without any formal greetings or signs of fear about his pale appearance. He repeated the name of the pest, the word bringing back an old memory of the days when he used to help his father mix the treatments. She confirmed his thought, adding that she had separated the 3 sickest plants from the rest of the collection to keep the others safe. She said the rest of the orchids looked healthy, despite the 5 years of neglect they had suffered in the dark. He could picture her hands moving over the green leaves with careful speed, her face serious as she worked under the dim glass roof. She told him that he was standing close to a pile of old clay pots on his left side, explaining that she did not want him to break them. Caspian stood still, realizing she was not running to guide him or shouting a warning, but simply giving him the facts he needed. The meetings in the large glass house became a regular habit that neither of them acknowledged with words, but both expected as the days grew shorter. Caspian would appear near the door every afternoon when the sun dropped below the pine trees, and Grace would continue her work without stopping her movements. Sometimes they exchanged short sentences about the weather, but mostly they stood in a comfortable silence that felt different from the heavy quiet of the main house. He began to ask specific questions about the rare plants, wanting to know if the special variations his father bought were still alive in their corners. She would answer him clearly, telling him which plants were growing new leaves and which ones she had moved into fresh soil during the morning. One evening, he stood near a large hanging basket, his head tilted, as he caught a warm, sweet scent that smelled like fresh vanilla. He asked her to describe the flower that produced the smell, staying in the shadow of a large palm tree while she worked with her knife. Grace stopped her work, looking at the unusual orchid that hung from the wooden frame above her head, its white petals marked with dark red spots. She thought for a few seconds, choosing simple words that would give him a clear image without using fancy language or poetic descriptions. She told him the flower was the size of a tea saucer, with thick white petals that felt like heavy cloth between the fingers. She added that the center of the bloom was a deep, dark red, looking like a drop of ink on clean white paper. She described how the leaves curved backward toward the stem, making the flower look like a tiny bird frozen in the middle of flight. Caspian did not say anything for a long time, standing so still that he looked like part of the stone wall behind him. He gave a small nod, his voice quiet, as he remarked that her description was exactly how he remembered the plant from his younger days. He knew these flowers well, holding their shapes and scents inside his mind, like old pictures that he kept locked away from the rest of the world. Her plain words were like a key that opened old rooms in his memory, allowing him to feel like a regular man who shared a passion for the land. That night, Caspian left his dark rooms and walked into the grand library, a large space filled with thousands of old books and heavy rugs. A servant had started a fire in the big stone hearth before leaving the room, filling the air with the comfortable smell of burning birchwood. Grace knocked gently on the dark wood of the door, holding a small green book she had found in the study earlier that morning. He told her to enter without turning his head, sitting in his large leather chair near the fire where the light did not reach his face. Grace walked inside, bringing that familiar smell of fresh rain and outdoor air into the old dusty room with her. She noted that Mrs. Weaver had mentioned he did not have anyone to read to him that evening, and she asked if he would allow her to stay. He asked her what kind of book she had brought, his voice suggesting that he expected her to choose a silly romance novel from the shelves. She told him she had found a recent report from the State Garden Society about the growth of wild berries in northern climates. A tiny smile appeared on his pale lips for a second before his face became serious again, pleased by her practical choice. He told her to take a seat, and she sat in the chair across from him, opening the book under the light of a small lamp. Grace read in a clear, steady voice that did not falter when she reached the long Latin names of the different plant families. She did not try to make the dry report sound exciting or dramatic, keeping her tone natural and easy to listen to as the fire burned down. Caspian closed his eyes and listened to the sound of her voice, finding that the words became clear pictures in his mind as she read. He could see the shapes of the hills she described and the colors of the wild fruit, feeling a sense of peace he had not known in 5 years. When she finished the first section of the report, she stopped and asked if he wanted her to continue reading, or if he preferred to be alone. He answered quickly, telling her to keep going, his voice warmer than it had been since she arrived at the estate. The evening reading became their second habit, moving from garden reports to books about ancient history and old journals written by early sea captains. During their fourth evening in the library, Caspian stood up to place another piece of wood onto the dying fire, a task he usually performed without any trouble. But a young maid had moved a small wooden stool near the hearth that morning, placing it outside its regular spot against the wall. His boot caught the edge of the wood, causing him to lose his balance and drop his walking stick, which made a loud noise on the floorboards. A dark look of anger and shame passed over his pale face as he caught himself against the stone mantelpiece, his fingers gripping the rock until his knuckles turned white. He stood completely still, his body tense, as he waited for the reaction he always received when he showed any sign of weakness. He expected her to gasp, run to his side, or offer those soft, worried words that made him feel like a broken animal in a cage. The room remained completely quiet for a long seconds with no sound except the crackle of the wood and the wind blowing against the outside glass. Grace stayed in her chair, keeping her book open on her lap as she looked at him with her regular calm expression. She spoke in a level voice, telling him that the wooden stool was 3 inches further to the right than it had been the night before. She added that the wood basket was located exactly by his left heel, giving him the precise information he needed to move safely. He did not move for a moment, taking a deep breath to calm the anger that had risen in his chest when he tripped. She told him that his dark walking stick had rolled under her chair, offering to pick it up or letting him walk 3 steps toward her voice to find it himself. Caspian turned his head toward her, taking 3 slow, deliberate steps until his boot touched the edge of her long wool skirt. He knelt on the rug, his pale hand moving across the floor until his fingers found the smooth, cool wood of his stick. He stood up slowly and walked back to the fireplace using the information she had given him to avoid the small stool without any further trouble. He threw the heavy log onto the fire, watching the bright red sparks fly up into the dark chimney, before turning his back to the heat. He looked toward her dark silhouette and asked why she did not offer him the pity that everyone else in the state gave him. Grace closed her book and said that pity was something people gave to the helpless, and she noted that he was far from helpless. She explained that he was a man who lived with a difficult history, and she said that deserved respect rather than tears. The change in Caspian was slow, like the melting of river ice at the end of a long Maine winter, showing itself in tiny movements rather than big words. He began to spend more hours in the large glass house during the late afternoons, sitting on the old wooden bench, while Grace worked on the high shelves. They talked about the land with Caspian, sharing stories about the old trips his father took to find rare seeds in South America when he was a boy. He described the smell of the mountain forests and the way the fog settled over the rivers at night, speaking with a clear memory that surprised her. He never spoke about the old curse or the title of Vampire King, keeping that part of his life behind a closed door that she never tried to open. Grace talked about her own childhood, describing the small house where she grew up, and the long days she spent helping her father dry flowers between pages of old newspapers. She spoke of a simple life that had no riches, but was filled with regular work and small moments of happiness that she still remembered with a smile. He listened to her stories, and as he listened, the dark silence that had filled his massive house for 5 years began to disappear from the rooms. One evening she was working on a strange new plant that had thick green leaves that felt different from the others in the collection. She remarked that the surface of the leaf felt like heavy velvet, speaking more to herself than to the man sitting in the shadow of the door. Caspian remained quiet for a long moment, before saying that he remembered the feel of that particular plant from his early collections. A sudden thought came to Grace, and she asked if he would like to come over and touch the leaf himself to check her identification. He became stiff at her suggestion, the offer of physical contact being something he had not experienced since he withdrew from the village. For 5 years, people had avoided his hands, afraid of the unnatural coldness of his white skin and the power that lived inside his family. He did not say yes, but he did not move away, either remaining on the bench, with his eyes fixed on the dark corner of the room. Grace set her small scissors down on the wood and walked over to his side, her boots making a soft sound against the stone floor. She did not grab his hand or pull him toward the shelf, choosing instead to place her fingers lightly against the sleeve of his dark coat. She told him the plant was located directly in front of his shoulder, guiding him with a gentle pressure that felt steady and sure. He allowed her to move his arm, his muscles tight, as he extended his pale fingers toward the shelf where the green pot sat. His fingers moved past the rough clay of the container, traveled up the short stem, and brushed against the wide surface of the leaf. He moved his thumb over the green skin, feeling the thick texture that felt exactly like the old material his father used for winter coats. A small breath escaped his lips, his hand remaining on the plant for a long time, as if he were reconnecting with an old friend. Grace did not pull her hand away from his sleeve, staying by his side in the warm room while the rain fell outside the glass roof. The contact was simple and practical, a small bridge over the dark space that had kept him alone for so many years. The quiet routine of the estate was interrupted one afternoon by the sudden arrival of an expensive carriage belonging to a wealthy neighbor named Vivian Cox. She was a woman who owned many houses in the county and spent her days collecting gossip about the old families of Silver Falls. Her carriage stopped before the main steps with a loud noise, and she walked into the grand hallway before Mrs. Weaver could announce her presence. Grace was in the library with Caspian, helping him check the old accounts from the local farms that supplied wood to the main house. Caspian's face became completely still when he heard the loud voice in the hall, his pale mask returning instantly as he sat straight in his chair. Vivian walked into the room, bringing a strong smell of expensive perfume and a loud voice that filled the quiet library completely. She looked at Caspian with an expression of fake sadness, telling him that she had heard he was finally allowing people to visit his dark home. She turned her sharp eyes toward Grace, asking if she was the young person Beatrice had hired to clean the old plants in the backyard. She called the job useful, remarking that Pinecrest had looked like a massive tomb for 5 years, and noting that it was nice to see some movement. Grace stood up from her desk and gave a small bow, her face showing no expression as she looked at the wealthy visitor. Vivian turned back to Caspian, ignoring Grace completely, as she told him he looked well, despite his unusual condition and his long isolation. She told him he must not stay inside the dark rooms, forever explaining that his old neighbors were always ready to support him in his tragic state. Caspian stood up from his chair, his tall shape looking imposing in the firelight, as he rested his pale hands on his dark walking stick. He told her in a cold voice that he was quite well, and thanked her for the short visit before noting that he and Grace were busy with the estate books. The dismissal was polite, but completely firm, causing Vivian's smile to disappear as she looked at the two of them standing together. She gathered her expensive wool coat and walked toward the door, saying that she would not keep him from his simple tasks, but reminding him that the town had not forgotten his name. She left the room with a loud step, leaving the smell of her perfume behind in the old air of the library. Caspian remained standing for a long time after the carriage drove away, his fingers pressing into the wood of his stick with great force. He repeated the word tomb in a low voice, his face dark with the old anger that had returned when the neighbors spoke of his condition. Grace walked back to her table and said that Vivian was a person who mistook curiosity for kindness and gossip for true concern. She told him that the woman's opinion meant nothing to the running of the estate, speaking with a simple certainty that made him look toward her. He remarked that Vivian spoke for the entire town, explaining that everyone said the same things about his white hair when he was not there to hear them. Grace looked at him and said that if the town thought that way, then the town was wrong, treating the statement like a simple fact about the weather. Her quiet words worked better than an argument, helping him release the tension in his shoulders as he sat back down in his chair. That evening, after the moon rose over the dark pine trees, Caspian asked Grace to do something they had never done before during her stay. He asked her to walk with him outside the house, choosing the late hour when the sun was completely gone, and the cold air was still. She agreed without any hesitation, putting on her heavy gray winter coat, and meeting him near the large glass doors of the side terrace. He took her arm with a firm grip that felt strong and certain, trusting her to guide him along the stone paths of the dark park. The night air was sharp and clean, smelling of sea salt pine needles and the cold mud that had frozen along the edges of the grass. They walked down the long gravel driveway, his steps steady, as she kept her pace matching his slow movement through the darkness. He commanded her to tell him what she saw in the night, his voice low, as they moved under the branches of the old trees. Grace became his eyes, describing the way the bright moonlight caught the frost on the grass, turning the yard into a field of silver. She described a group of small deer that stood near the edge of the woods, watching them pass with wide, dark eyes before moving back into the trees. She told him about the condition of the stone walls, the old gate that needed new oil, and the roof of the small barn that had lost some wood during the last wind. Her descriptions were detailed and practical, omitting any fancy words and focusing on the real state of the property he owned. Caspian listened closely, and as they walked, the massive estate began to feel like a real place, with regular needs rather than a prison where he was hidden away. The next morning, for the first time in 5 years, Caspian sent a message to his land manager ordering him to come to the main office to discuss the winter repairs. The shift at Pinecrest became clear to all the servants within a few days, breaking the old silence that had ruled the building for so long. The sound of hammers came from the old barns near the north field, and a team of local men began clearing the fallen logs from the forest paths. The heavy wooden shutters on the ground floor were opened during the late afternoon, allowing the cool air to move through the old rooms. The servants who used to walk through the halls with the quiet steps of people at a funeral began to talk in regular voices as they did their work. They saw their master walking through the trees with the young botanist, and they heard his clear voice giving orders about the wood supplies. Beatrice came to visit the estate 2 weeks later, her sharp blue eyes taking in the open windows and the active movement of the workmen in the yard. She found her nephew sitting in the library with Grace, a large ledger book open on the wide wooden table between them. Caspian was speaking, clearly dictating a letter to his lawyer about the farm leases, while Grace wrote the words down in her clean, steady handwriting. Beatrice watched them from the door for a minute, her face showing a quiet satisfaction that she did not try to hide with words. Her nephew's face looked active and alive, his brow furrowed in deep thought as he discussed the details of the local business with the young woman. She walked down to the glass house later that afternoon, finding Grace alone, as she cut the dead leaves from a row of small purple flowers. Beatrice told Grace that she had worked a great change in the old house, looking around at the clean glass and the rows of thriving green plants. Grace did not take the credit, answering simply that the rare orchids only needed regular water and clean soil to grow well after the long neglect. The older woman smiled, remarking that men needed the same kind of steady care to recover from their old wounds, and she thanked Grace for her work. Grace looked up from her plants, her face serious, as she stated that she had done nothing beyond the duties she was paid to perform. Beatrice shook her head gently and said that she knew the true value of what was happening at Pinecrest, regardless of the simple words Grace used to describe it. But the world outside the gates remained unchanged, and the old letters that Caspian kept in his study still held the memory of his past rejections. Later that week, while Grace was looking for an old map of the property in a low wooden cabinet, she found a stack of letters tied with a blue string. The papers were addressed to Caspian, and the dates showed they had arrived during the first 2 years after he became the king of his line. Caspian entered the library from the side door, sensing her presence near the cabinet, and asking what she had found in the old drawer. She told him she had found a collection of unopened letters from his aunt, her voice calm as she read the old dates from the paper. He remained silent for a moment before telling her to open the first letter and read the words aloud to him in the quiet room. Grace untied the blue string and began to read the old message, which was written with a hopeful energy that felt strange in the silent library. The letter spoke of a wealthy young woman from a neighboring town who had a beautiful voice and loved to play the piano in the evenings. The message explained that the girl was coming to visit Pinecrest and suggested that she would make a perfect wife for the young master. The second letter, written a month later, held a completely different tone, full of disappointment and short explanations about why the visit had failed. The young woman had arrived, stayed for a short hour while looking at Caspian with fear, and left the house the next morning with a poor excuse about her health. Grace read through the remaining letters, her voice steady, but her heart growing heavy, as each page showed the same sad pattern. Every note told the story of another meeting that had been arranged with hope and had ended with a quick departure and a polite note of refusal. The letters were a clear record of his rejection by the world, each one reminding him that people saw him as a monster rather than a man. When she finished the last page, the silence in the library felt deep with no sound except the small click of the fire against the bricks. Caspian did not move from his chair, his tall body completely still, as he looked toward the dark window where the night had settled. The warmth that had grown in his face over the past weeks vanished, replaced by the cold, pale mask that he had worn for 5 years. He spent the next 3 days in complete isolation, refusing to come to the glass house and canceling their evening reading sessions in the library. He spoke only to his regular valet, using single words to give his orders, while the house grew quiet again around his absence. Grace showed great patience during his retreat, continuing her daily tasks in the glass house without trying to force him back into her company. She knew that the old letters had reminded him of the pain he had suffered, and she understood that he had to face those memories alone. On the 5th night, after the servants had gone to sleep, Caspian appeared at the open door of her small sitting room in the east wing. She was sitting near her lamp, using a needle to repair a small hole in a white lace curtain that had been damaged by the damp air. She looked up when he stepped inside her face, calm and welcoming, as he walked over to the glass window and stood with his back to her. He spoke in a rough voice, saying that the people from the towns only saw his old fortune and his historic name until they looked at his face. He pointed a pale hand toward his white hair and his amber eyes, asking what regular woman would choose a life with a creature of the night. He called himself a broken thing, who could not walk in the sun or share a regular life with a wife in the bright towns. The question held a deep sorrow that had stayed inside his chest for years, a cry of loneliness from a man who felt completely cut off from humanity. Grace set her needle down on the table, her hands remaining steady as she looked at the long, dark line of his back against the glass. She did not walk over to him or offer soft words of comfort, choosing to speak from her chair with a clear voice that filled the room. She told him that a woman of intelligence would not care about a historic title or a mountain of old gold, but would look for the character of the man himself. She said that a sensible woman would not look for someone to dance with in the bright ballrooms of the city, but would want a partner with wisdom and strength. She added that Caspian was a man of integrity who had faced a difficult change that would have broken lesser people over the years. She described him as a man who knew his land, perfectly cared for his people with justice, and held a deep respect for the living world around him. She paused for a moment to let her words settle in the quiet room before telling him that a true woman would choose exactly him for her husband. The silence that followed her statement was complete, with Caspian remaining as still as a stone statue against the dark glass of the window. Then he turned around slowly, his face showing a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a tiny spark of new hope that he could not hide. He spoke her name in a low whisper that sounded like a question, extending his pale hand toward her across the small space of the room. Grace stood up from her chair and walked over to his side, taking his cold hand between both of her own with a firm grip. His fingers were icy to the touch, but she held them tightly, letting the warmth of her own skin move into his hands without any sign of hesitation. She told him that she had already made her choice, looking up into his amber eyes with a steady certainty that broke the last of his fears. Caspian drew a long, shaky breath, his fingers closing around her hands with a strength that showed how much he needed her presence in his life. He could not change his vampire nature or the white hair that marked his line, but he could feel the truth of her words in the steady pressure of her hands. The days that followed their meeting in the sitting room brought a quiet understanding to the old estate, even though neither of them spoke of marriage immediately. Caspian returned to his regular habits, walking through the pine forest with her in the evenings and sitting by her side in the warm glass house while she worked. The space between them felt different now, filled with a shared confidence that showed in the small movements of their daily routine. When he offered his arm during their walks, the touch felt natural and certain rather than a practical way to keep from falling on the path. One cold morning, after a light snow had covered the hills around Silver Falls, he led her through the long corridors of the main house. They walked past the regular reception rooms, moving toward a part of the building that Grace had never explored during her months at the estate. They stopped before a pair of massive wooden doors that were carved with old designs and covered in a thin layer of gray dust from years of neglect. Caspian told her that these doors led to the grand ballroom of the West Wing, explaining that he had not unlocked them since his father passed away. Grace looked at the old wood, realizing that this was the room where his family used to host the big parties for the county before his retreat. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a heavy iron key, his hand hovering near the lock for a second before he turned the metal. The lock opened with a loud grating noise, and he pushed the heavy doors forward, stepping back into the shadow as the cold air from the room moved out. Grace walked over the threshold first, looking around the giant space that had been left alone in the dark for 5 whole years. The room was beautiful, but sad, with thick dust covering the polished wood floor like a gray blanket under the light of the high windows. White sheets covered the large glass lamps that hung from the ceiling, making them look like sleeping birds, frozen in the middle of the empty air. A few columns of morning light fell through the cracks in the wooden shutters, showing the millions of tiny dust particles that danced in the cold air. She told him the room was magnificent, but lonely, explaining that it looked like a beautiful place that had been forgotten by its friends for too long. Caspian stepped inside the room, his dark walking stick making a clear sound on the wood as he moved toward her shape in the center of the floor. He stated that he could never lead a dance or share a regular celebration under the bright lights of a city ballroom with her. Grace looked up at his pale face and said that a room did not need dancing to be beautiful, explaining that it only needed someone to open the doors and let the light back inside. Caspian looked down at her, his amber eyes clear as he spoke her name, and asked her to remain at Pinecrest for the rest of her life. He asked her to stay not as a worker who tended his rare orchids, but as his wife and the companion of his long days. Grace did not need time to think about her answer, telling him softly that she had already given him her heart during their long winter evenings. He lifted his pale hand and touched her face with a gentle movement, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek, before he bent down to kiss her. The kiss was quiet and full of a deep commitment that connected their different worlds inside the old stone walls of the estate. The glass houses at Pinecrest grew into a spectacular display of life and color as the winter gave way to the first green shoots of a Maine spring. Orchids from every part of the world hung from the new wooden frames, filling the warm, humid air with a rich scent that people could smell from the driveway. The heavy wooden shutters on the west wing were removed permanently, allowing the evening light to fill the rooms where Caspian now spent his hours working with his land managers. The old ballroom had been cleaned and restored, turning into a comfortable music room where they sat together after the sun went down behind the trees. Grace sat near the large fireplace in a comfortable green chair, her gray suits replaced by dresses of soft blue wool that matched the color of the evening sky. She looked out the tall windows toward the pine forest, her hand resting on her lap, as she thought about the child they were expecting in the coming season. Caspian sat across from her, his white hair looking silver in the firelight, and his pale face relaxed in a way that showed his deep peace of mind. He reached out his hand and found her arm without any trouble, his movements natural and sure because he knew the rhythm of her presence perfectly. He did not need regular sight to understand the world when she was by his side, using her clear words to see the colors of the changing seasons outside his walls. He knew that his vampire nature would always keep him separate from the busy life of the village, and he knew his white skin would always draw whispers from strangers. The old wound from his past remained a part of his history, but it no longer kept him hidden in the dark rooms of the West Wing. He looked toward the future with a steady heart, knowing that the love they built had not changed his history, but had given him a whole life to share.